Welcome to Dairy Pod, a podcast series from Dairy Australia. Featuring a range of experts, each episode offers insights into Australia's unique dairy farming conditions, as well as personal experiences and the latest in dairy innovation.
Welcome to Dairy Pod. My name's Cath Lescun and I'm the National Soils and Water Lead for Dairy Australia, working in the Research and Innovation team. My guest today is Dr. James Hills, who's the Livestock Production Centre Leader at the Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture. Welcome, James, and thank you for joining me today to discuss irrigation management. But before we get started, can you please tell me a little bit about yourself and your background in the dairy industry and your background with irrigation research?
Oh, thanks, Cath. I've been involved particularly in the research side of the dairy industry for the past 13 years, working here in Tasmania, in northwest Tasmania, and doing a lot of work around pasture and pasture production, but particularly around irrigation. In Tassie, most of our dairy area is irrigated, and so a lot of people rely on irrigation, particularly pivot type irrigation. So we've certainly done a lot of work in that area, working with farmers to help them to improve their efficiency and use of water.
Yeah, and certainly one of the projects that we've worked on together, James, was that Smarter Irrigation for Profit project, looking at how we can improve a lot of the irrigation management and help farmers make good decisions around irrigation. And one of Dairy Australia's strategic priorities is for the efficient use of resources and inputs, and this includes irrigation water. And I feel like this season could be really challenging for irrigators. We started off with really dry conditions, and in parts of Victoria we've had dry conditions, for 18 months. And so when irrigation started, it was pretty dry, but in some areas we've now had rainfall, and so it's challenging for irrigators to work out when to irrigate and how much to irrigate between those rainfall events. But even before that, when should they start irrigating in terms of starting at the beginning of the season? So I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about this today. And let's think about, even before we start irrigating, what are some of the things that you would think some farmers should do to before they start irrigating?
I think in preparing for the season, you want to be preparing ahead of when you need it. And so the basic things of that, is your pump working? Are you able to deliver the water to the area you need it to? So doing some checks, starting it up before you need it is really, really important. Because if you get to the point where you need to irrigate and you find that you're going to have to delay because it doesn't work, then that has a big cost or a big potential cost on production. So is your system working? For a lot of your above ground systems, there are things to check like with pivots, you got your tire pressures. Is your pivot running correctly? Are all your nozzles working? Are there any major leaks? Those sort of things I think are important to check. But one of the things I think that's particularly important to check is, do you have the pressure right at the end of your pivot? Based on the specifications for that particular irrigator. Because if your pressure isn't right, then your depth of water that is applied or is to be applied will be very different to what it should be or what it's been designed to be. So you need to be making sure that that's all okay, and then get some irrigation expert to come in and help if it isn't correct. So what I would be doing early in the season is not only checking is it going and are all the leaks fixed and all that sort of thing, but then I'd be checking, well, how much are you actually applying when you turn your pivot on. So if your pivot or your irrigator has been set up to put on 10 or 11 mils in a pass, then is it actually doing that? And we've found that when we've gone out and checked a lot of irrigation systems, what they think they're putting on is generally not what they are putting on. And so you've really got to make sure you do that. And it's simple to check that. You just go and put some buckets or some rain gauges or some catch cans out there and actually collect it and have a look and see whether you're somewhere near what you think you're putting in. And if you're underwatering because you're only putting on 5 or 6 mils instead of 10 or 11 mils, then very quickly you're going to be losing productivity in that system.
Yeah, right. And what I was going to say, James, is, or ask the question, what when you've gone out and you've checked out some of those systems in terms of looking at how much water's being put on or not put on, what's the usual result? Is it that farmers are putting on too much water, or are they putting on too little water on the whole?
But typically it's that there's a lot less being applied than what they think they're applying. And that leads to what we would call the green drought scenario. And we can talk about that a little bit later. But certainly underwatering is probably the biggest issue we've seen with the checks that we've done on irrigation systems, at least here in Tassie.
Yeah, okay. So you just mentioned then the green drought. So let's just delve into that a little bit. What's the definition of a green drought?
To me, the definition of a green drought is that your pastures are green, they look like they're doing okay, but when you actually go out and measure what you're growing a lot less than what you potentially could be if you were irrigating correctly. So our situation would be that a farmer is so used to expecting a certain amount of pasture growth rate because they've been irrigating in a particular way, but when you measure their irrigation and you have a look at their pasture growth rate, they're only putting on probably a lot less than what they thought they were putting on, and they're only growing about 30% less than what they potentially could be. And so in that scenario, they think everything's all right. It looks very green. It looks very nice, but their actual growth rates are a lot less than what they potentially could be. To me, that's probably my definition of a green drought. There may be others, depending on the context in drier areas where it's not necessarily that's even growing at all. Some people call a green drought something where everything looks green and stays green, but you're actually getting no growth. Now, I certainly, particularly in those dryland conditions, you can get some nice green-looking fields, but if it's not growing, well, then that's really a green drought, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, that's right. So you've mentioned there 30% reduction in tonnes of dry matter grown. So if that's over a few months of the summer months, you've got green grass that looks like, pastures that look like they're growing. It's a big reduction in production there. So I guess that's one of the reasons to make sure that you're putting on the amount of water that you need to put on to be irrigating your pastures well and getting the best production out of them and getting the best out of the water that you're using. So that's one of the impacts of not getting the irrigation right up front. Like green drought, we need to avoid it. We are losing production if we don't get that right. So I guess the next question then, if we're moving on from that, James, is how can a farmer tell, or how can we tell if how much water we need to put on? How does a farmer work that out?
Yeah, well, that depends on quite a few things, but particularly the soil type. So what is your soil type and how much water does that hold? It depends on the type of pasture you've got and or plants that you've got within that system and how deep the roots are. And it depends on what we would call the evapotranspiration, so the amount of water that is being lost within a system. So if you're in, say, for instance, South Australia, where in a typical summer day, you're losing 11, 12 or 13 mils of water, compared with, say, in Tassie, we're only using 5 or 6 mils of water, well then that's a completely different scenario in terms of the size of your bucket and how quickly you need to be coming back and watering again. So starting with the soil type, which is, I think, really crucial. You've got to understand your soil. If you've got a soil that is, say, a higher clay content, typically down here in Tassie, a ferrocell soil, well, then the amount of water that can hold will be more than a soil perhaps that is of a sandy texture. So in a sandy soil, you compare a pasture, which typically has a rooting depth of up to 30 centimetres. If you look at that profile, then you might be able to have available about 15 millimetres of water in a sandy soil, whereas you might only have available about 25 mils in a ferrocell. So depending on your soil type, the type of plant and the rooting depth, that'll depend on how much water is available to irrigate with, which then helps you to understand how you need to schedule.
Yeah, right. So if I've got 25 mil of water in a clay type soil available to my pasture or my forage crop, how do I know how much the pasture actually needs on a daily basis or a weekly basis? So between irrigations, how do I work that one out?
Yeah, well, that really depends on how quickly that is being used by the plant, or how much is being lost from that bucket of water within the soil. And so one of the simplest ways to understand that is to look at what you would call your evapotranspiration rate. That is the rate at which that water is moving through the plant. That's transpiration. So that's how much water the plant is using, and then how much is being lost from the ground. That's evaporation. So you combine the two of those figures together, you'll get something that's called evapotranspiration. So having an understanding of how much water is being used every day at any particular time in the year will then tell you how much you need to replace of that water that's being used, either by rainfall or by irrigation. So if you've got a week, say in the middle of summer down here in Tasmania, where you might be losing 5 or 6 millimetres every day, that means within a week you might be needing 35 to 40 millimetres of water to replace what is being lost. If you go to some of the hotter areas on the mainland, I'm familiar with some of those areas in particularly in South Australia and places like that, where you might be losing 12 or 13 or 14 millimetres a day in the peak, then that's more like 80 or 90 mils of water in a week that you would need to be replacing for what is being lost. So, so getting a measure of your evapotranspiration is really important, and having an understanding of what that is. Say at this time of year in Tasmania, where it's cooler, you might only be losing 2 or 3 mils a day, which is only about 20 mils over a week. So you need to understand that.
Yep. And from what you said there, that your evapotranspiration is you've talked about that in terms of the water lost, but it's the water that's evaporated or transpired by the plant, and so it's being used for that growth and that production. And also the readily available water, if we think about the readily available water, that's the water between field capacity and a refill point in terms of that soil. So then how do we work out if you've got no other tools, and we'll talk about tools in a little bit later, but how do you then work out, if you've got no other tools, when to start watering and how much to put on?
Okay. So if we're coming out of a winter season and we've had rainfall and everything's quite wet, and we're moving into and so this is obviously a southern Australia example where we have winter rainfall and we're coming out into our spring, we've had a wet period of time, what you will find is that you'll look at the amount of rainfall that's occurring each day, and you'll look at the amount of evapotranspiration. Where the rainfall exceeds the evapotranspiration, then everything's going to stay wet. When you reach that point within the season where over a week the amount of evapotranspiration starts to exceed the amount of rainfall going into the system, then you're going to start to find that your water is going to be used and your soil profile is going to start to dry out. So by keeping an eye on the total rainfall and the total evaporation week by week, once you start to see that the rainfall is less than the amount of evaporation or evapotranspiration occurring, that's when you start to need to think seriously about being ready to fire up your irrigator. So that to me is an important tool. So obviously you need to be able to get that data. And so the Bureau of Meteorology is obviously one of those sites where you can pick up that data and you can even find information that's relevant to your area. It's really important that you try and find a source of evapotranspiration data that's close to where you are, so that it actually relates to what's happening where you are. There are other providers out there that can provide you with emails every day that give you an estimation of what the evapotranspiration will be for the week that's ahead, and so you can use those things to give you a bit of an idea of and they'll also indicate rainfall within a lot of those predictions, and so you can compare those and use that to help you.
Yep. Yeah, that's great. And so to clarify that, really, if you've got 25 mils of water in your bucket or in your soil, because your soil type or your soil texture is a heavier clay, you've got 25 mils. If your plant's evapotranspiration is occurring at 6 mils, you've got that 4 days before, with no rainfall, before your bucket is depleted of water. Is that right in round figures?
Yeah. So it's just a matter of how many mils difference is there? If there's 3 mils difference 3 or 4 mils difference every day, so there's 3 or 4 mils being lost every day, then, over 4 or 5 days you've used your 20 to 25 mils. Well, then that's when you need to start irrigating. So once you've depleted your bucket. And we were talking a lot about this raw, aren't we, which is readily available water. It's a concept that's pretty simple, really. I mean, when we look at a soil profile and we look at the amount of water that's in it, if we talk about field capacity, that's when the soil profile is full. Once you go above that, you're saturation, so water is pooling. So once you've got a situation in which pooled water has disappeared, you're at field capacity. That's when the soil is holding as much water as it can. And then as that soil profile dries out, it'll move down to what we call the refill point, which you mentioned before. That refill point is a really important point because once you go below that refill point, the amount of water that the soil's holding below the refill, that's when the plants are going to have to really start to work hard to draw that water out of the soil because the soil hangs onto that water. So there's still plenty of water there, but it's going to become at a cost. The readily available water is the amount of water that's in the soil that the plants can readily extract and don't have to use a lot of energy to do that. And that's what we need to really focus on. And so that's that term, readily available water, is an important term to understand between field capacity and your refill point.
Yeah, that's great, James. That's really good. And it's complex, but it's not. So I suppose that some of the figures sound complex to work out, but when you've got them sorted in your head, they're not as complex. But what are some other ways that farmers can determine where their soil moisture's at?
There's the simple method of going out with a shovel, digging a bit of soil, picking it up in your hand, squeezing it. And look, there are things that are available to you to give you an indication of what it might feel like if you've got a clay soil and it's kind of at a refill point versus at a field capacity. So you can get some tech notes and other things online from various places. A lot of departments of ag have those, and so you can certainly get those things to help you. But what I would say is that what you would do is you would go out after a significant rain event when you know that the soil profile is going to be full. So there's been 40 or 50 mils of rain and then it's dropped down to the point where it's not puddling. You go out there and you go and dig a hole and feel that. If you get a feel for that, that's what field capacity is probably going to be like in the type of soil that you've got. And so having a knowledge of that then, as you go through the season, when you go and dig a hole and pick a bit up and squeeze it, and you'll certainly get an idea. But as you start to dry out, what you're going to find is that if it's in a clay soil, it's not going to be sticking to your hand. It's not going to be able to be pulled into a bolus, or it's not going to be able to ribbon really well. That's when it's really starting to dry down. So you can use that process to try and get a feel for it. Probably an easier way to do it, and I always advocate people go out and dig holes so they get familiar with their sites and so forth. But using a soil moisture probe, they're very readily available these days. And the beauty of a lot of them, particularly the capacitance probes that can measure at various soil depths from the one probe, is you can get an idea of what's happening to that soil moisture just as an app on your phone in real time. And so using a soil moisture probe, you can start to see when the soil moisture starts to disappear from the profile at 10 centimetres, 20 centimetres, 30 centimetres, and you can start to get a feel for what's happening. And those tools are really, really good in combination with understanding your evapotranspiration and the calculations there. Certainly they're the tools that we would mainly use.
Okay. And if I can diverge a little bit, just in terms of some of the Dairy High 2 work that you're doing down in TIA, and I know that you've got quite a few soil probes and across that farmlet site. Is there any tips that you've gained or lessons you've learnt from that project that you're running at the moment in terms of irrigation and soil probes that you can give to farmers?
Yeah, well, within that particular project, we have a lot more soil probes than what you would normally have. I think we've got about 30-odd probes because it is a research trial. You probably only need 2 or 3. You need them in probably maybe an area that's typical of what you're doing, and maybe an area that's slightly drier, as long as it's an area that's covers a reasonable area of your pivot, so that you can interpret it and water to it. But getting a couple of measures of that would be important. But within the SIP2 project, what what we wanted to do, not the SIP2 project, sorry, the Dairy High-2 project, what we wanted to do is to make sure we removed limitations due to irrigation. So we wanted to make sure we were irrigating adequately. So putting the probes in meant that as we come through winter, we can see how the soil moisture remains at field capacity or above, and it sits there with a lot of rainfall and quite wet. As we start to see that soil moisture turn the corner and drop, not only at 10 centimetres, but then at 20 and 30, as we head towards spring, as we start to see that starts to tell us very quickly, right, we're at the point now where we need to think about being ready to irrigate. So we'll now start to go back and have a look at our evapotranspiration rates and our rainfall rates and see what the difference is. So we kind of keep an eye on the probe data to start with. One of the reasons for that's important at the beginning of a season, particularly in these southern regions where we have a very wet winter, is that sometimes you can have quite a bit of groundwater or water in the lower profile that has a capillary rise effect, so it comes up into the top 20 or 30 centimetres over time. So if you do just a calculation of evapotranspiration versus rainfall, you might think it's drying out, but the soil profile's staying wet because there's either water laterally flowing down a hill, keeping things moist underground, or coming up from a bit lower down. And so sometimes the calculation between evapotranspiration and rainfall, so the difference between those, can indicate it's drying out when it actually isn't. So a soil moisture probe will tell you exactly when that moisture is starting to drop, not only at 10 centimetres, but at 20 and 30 centimetres and 40 centimetres, for instance. So we use that to really tell us when we think it's appropriate to be ready to turn our irrigators on. And then by looking at that, along with our evapotranspiration data, we can start to plan. Okay, it looks like this week we're going to only get 10 mils of rain, and we're actually going to lose 30 mils. Therefore, there's going to be a 20 mil gap. So we reckon that by 2 or 3 days from now, right, with the prediction of no rain, that we're going to have to turn our irrigator on and start irrigating. So we use the combination of the soil probe data and the calculation of evapotranspiration and rainfall.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so that's getting really precise in terms of the irrigation and irrigation management, isn't it?
We would keep an eye on that every single week. So we have a meeting once a week, for instance, and we look at all of our soil moisture probe every week within that meeting with a team of us, and make sure that we're then predicting what the next week looks like in terms of our irrigation programs.
Yeah, that's great. And so if a farmer hasn't got a soil probe, they can do their calculations of the crop water use and raw, and look at when field capacity is and things like that. But, through Victoria, and there's a whole series of soil probes with the results from those soil probes available online through the AgVic website. Is there systems like that are with information publicly available in Tassie?
Yeah, there absolutely are. There are providers of data. So there's a company down here called AgLogic, and they've put a lot of probes out under irrigated areas, as well as now under dryland areas. And people can subscribe to them and access their data. So there are others out there doing that. There are a number of publicly available sites within Tasmania as well. So the EnvironPro systems that we've got set up through the university, through TIA, are available publicly for people to log on to, and they can see some weather station data there, and in some cases they can see some soil moisture probe data. But generally speaking, what you've got to be careful of is that if you're looking at a set of data on a soil probe, you've got to make sure that what is being represented there is indicative of what your current situation is on your farm. So if it is in an irrigated area and that person's irrigating and you're not, well, then you're not going to get any help from it. If it's a dryland one, that'll at least tell you at what stage things are going to start to dry out due to lack of rain. But yeah, just make sure that what you're looking at makes sense in terms of where you are.
Yeah, that's a good point. Very good point there, because there are a whole heap of probe networks around, but yes, just ensure that they're relevant to what you've got. The other one, James, that came up in Smarter Irrigation was a tool called irripasture, looking at irripasture, and that's a free web tool. Can you tell us a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, so irripasture developed with the University of Southern Queensland and through that SIP project. It's a simple app that really works on the basis of a water balance, where you're just looking at rainfall in and irrigation in versus evapotranspiration out. And so it does that calculation for you. So if you set within that particular app, you can identify where you are in terms of your farm. It can then find what is the closest Bureau of Meteorology weather station that would be relevant to that. And what happens within that app is that you set up the paddocks that you think you need to monitor, and it'll automatically then download the rainfall data from the Bureau of Meteorology's closest weather station. So that information will come automatically into the app. All you then need to do is to add in your irrigation events, and it'll use that information to give you an estimation of where your water is between fill capacity and your refill point. And so what it does is it tracks that. So you have this beautiful little graph that you can follow. And so it's tracking the soil moisture between your refill point and your fill capacity. And so you can see that line and watch it. And when it starts to get down towards refill point, then you know that you've got to be irrigating. Otherwise, you're going to start to cost yourself. And so, no, that particular app, it's free. It obviously, the limitation to it is that it only takes water from the Bureau of Meteorology or weather station that's closest to it. But what you can do is you can update that with your own information. So if you've got your own rain gauge on site and you're measuring that, you can take that and add that in. So you can override what comes in from the Bureau of Meteorology. So you can actually make sure that it is relevant to your particular site if your weather station that the Bureau of Meteorology has is too far away. But it's a very simple tool. It's a very visual tool, and it really helps you to visualise where that soil moisture is based on that water balance, the difference between your evapotranspiration and rainfall in an irrigation needs.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's good. It's good. So I guess in closing, we've covered a fair bit of ground this morning. We've looked at, green drought and how we can avoid the green droughts and soil types, and how our readily available water is different for different soil types. Evapotranspiration and some tools that we can use. But what are some of your the key messages that you would give to farmers who are starting to irrigate or thinking about irrigating now for the coming season?
I think one of the key messages is don't start too late, because if you start too late in the season, it's going to cost you. Now, we've done some work here many years ago that shows that for every day's delay in irrigation, that's when the soil drops below the refill point. So when you're delaying too far and the plants are having to work hard, for every day's delay, you're losing the equivalent of about 105 kilos of dry matter per hectare across the season. So you've got to look at it. So if you delay by a week, then very, very quickly that's going to start to add up in the tons of dry matter that are lost because you're not producing what you should be producing. So don't delay. And my message around that is around even if you've got a pasture that may have a few low-lying areas that stay a little bit wet, if those areas are not a big portion of your whole area that you're managing, then I would even go to the point of saying, make sure that your irrigation starts up when the majority of the area is starting to get down towards the refill point, not when those wet areas have dried out. I don't care about those wet areas, because a wet area, unless it's totally anaerobic, a little bit too much water is not going to have as big a cost in production than too little. The biggest cost to over-irrigating is going to be, obviously, you're not being efficient with the use of your water. Secondly, you're going to lose maybe some of your nutrients, potassium and nitrogen, if you wash them through, if you're over-irrigating, and you might have some nitrous oxide loss, as a result of denitrification if it's too wet, and you might be pugging your paddocks. But generally, a farmer won't be putting lots of irrigation on when it's too wet. So I would say, no, even at the beginning of the season, make sure you're not too late, even if there are a few little wet patches. Start up. So startup's really, really important. The second message I think that's really important is make sure your scheduling is going to be on time. Scheduling is so important. So when you're going to be scheduling to turn your irrigator on, make sure you're not underwatering and heading towards this green drought scenario. Keep an eye on the fact that you want to be continually filling up towards your fill capacity, and then not letting it drop below your refill point. One of the dangers for some people when they're irrigating is that they'll allow their soil moisture to drop down a little bit too low, and it drops down below the refill point. And then they think, oh, panic, I've got to get this irrigation turn on, they'll turn it on. But if the capacity of that irrigator is not enough to fill you back up to your full point, your fuel capacity, and it doesn't rain for an extended period of time, maybe you need 7 or 8 or 9 mils a day in summer, and you've allowed it to dry down, and you're only able to put 6 or 7 mils in, then it doesn't matter how much you irrigate from then on, you're behind, and your ability to catch up can be impacted by that. And so your production will stay low until you've got another rain event that helps you to fill right back up again. So making sure you keep an eye on it so that you don't let your soil moisture drop below that refill point, I think is really important. So scheduling it regularly enough to keep that water within that readily available water zone, I think, is a very, very key message. We've seen situations here in Tassie where when we've gone out and measured what farmers have done, instead of producing 80-odd kilos of dry matter per hectare per day on average during the summer season where they're irrigating, they're only growing about 50 to 60 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day. And if you look at that over a period of 4 or 5 months of irrigation season, if they're not achieving what they can expect to achieve, and you're losing that 30 to 40 kilos that you could potentially be growing, if you multiply that over months, you could be losing 4 or 5 tonnes of dry matter per hectare. And on a big pivot, 100 hectare pivot, that could be up to 500 tonnes, more than $100,000 worth of feed to replace what you could have grown if you'd just been effectively irrigating. So it can become very, very costly. So a clear message: get your scheduling right and don't start too late.
Great. Well, they're very clear messages, James, and I think with the information that we've talked about, people have got some information and some tools to try and make sure that they do start at the right time and they get their scheduling right so that they can make the best use of their water, but also ensure that they get the best pasture production that they can from the water that they're using. So thank you very much for your time today. It's always a pleasure speaking to you, and I hope that we can speak to you again soon.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Cath. Yeah.
Thank you for joining today's Dairy Pod episode. We hope you found it enjoyable and insightful. For more information, check out the episode notes. You can stay up to date by following Dairy Pod on your favourite podcast platform. To get in touch, visit dairyaustralia.com.au. Until next time, take care.